Good evening. Good evening and welcome to one and all. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually this evening, and I'm looking forward to seeing many of you both in person and on Zoom 2 weeks from today, almost exactly at this time, for the Jewish Center annual dinner here at the Jewish Center. If you've not already registered, I encourage you to do so at the first possible opportunity. Tonight's program brings together two important components of the Jewish Center. It's both our annual May and Samuel Rudin lecture and the capstone event to our year of active listening. I want to thank the members of the Rudin family and the Rudin Foundation for their ongoing support. Over the years, this lecture has become a major event for our community, as we've hosted prominent statesmen and former spies, world-renowned architects and actors, Nobel laureates and Pulitzer Prize winners. And tonight, our legacy of excellence continues as we're honored to host not only a highly accomplished politician, but a civil rights leader and humanitarian. I want to thank, too, the outstanding members of our Deval committee for shepherding us on this journey of active listening, and special thanks to Virginia for helping us arrange this spectacular evening. With the kind of thoughtfulness, sensitivity, and nuance that's so often missing from our public discourse, our Deval events have made us all better listeners and all better learners as we grapple with the complex issues of our day. It would be hard to imagine a speaker more qualified or better suited to share thoughts on where to go from here. In our Parsha on Shabbat, in our weekly Torah portion, we'll read the story of the biblical personality most associated with rebellion and conflict. In rabbinic tradition, Korach becomes the epitome of machlokes shelo l'shem shamayim. He generated the kind of debate that's so self-serving it has the effect of bringing people down rather than lifting them up. And of course, we know how the story ends, but there's also a message for us in how Moshe Rabbeinu reacts. No one wants to be criticized. No one wants to be attacked. To make matters worse, Moshe surely knew that Korach's complaints were disingenuous. And yet the Torah tells us two words that would seem to be entirely extraneous. Vayishma Moshe. Moshe didn't dismiss the arguments out of hand. He didn't banish dissenters from the camp. Vayishma Moshe, first and foremost, he listened. It struck me that among his many talents, Governor Patrick is a listener. He's curious and interested. Questions matter. The sheer range of his accomplishments is an indication of the extent to which he's been able to be in dialogue with others and to elevate those around him in the process. A graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Governor Patrick clerked for a federal appellate judge and then launched a career as an attorney, business executive, becoming a staff attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, assistant attorney general for civil rights in the Clinton administration, partner at two Boston law firms, and a senior executive at two Fortune 50 companies. In 2006, in his first bid for elective office, he became Massachusetts' first African-American governor and served in that position with distinction for 2 terms. He now serves as a senior advisor at Bain Capital and has founded a number of civic and social organizations, some of which I hope we'll learn more about this evening. He's also a Rockefeller Fellow, a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, and the author of 2 books, A Reason to Believe, Lessons from an Improbable Life, and Faith in the Dream, A Call to the Nation to Reclaim American Values. We've prepared some questions, and the chat will be open for those who'd like to submit additional questions from the audience over the course of the evening. But first, I'd like to ask Governor Patrick to share some opening remarks. It's a pleasure to introduce our May and Samuel Rudin Scholar, Governor Deval Patrick.
Mercy. Thank you, Rabbi Levine, for your very, very kind and generous introduction. I'm grateful to you, and I am also to Virginia Hurd and Rabbi Hurd for inviting me to participate tonight. And good evening, brothers and sisters. It's good to be with you in this digital way, but especially in these times of tumult and change. I hope you've been able to keep yourselves and your families safe and healthy. And I commend you for committing yourselves to this year of active listening. It's not just a good, but a critical use of the time we have. I think it was Louis Pasteur who said that being educated was learning to listen to anything without losing your temper or your self-confidence. In not so many words, my family had the same expectations of what impact education would have on me. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. My parents split when I was 4, after which I grew up with my grandparents, my mother and sister, and various other relatives who came and went in our grandparents' 2-bedroom tenement, much of that time on welfare. I shared one of those bedrooms and a set of bunk beds with my mother and sister, on which we would rotate from the top to the bottom to the floor every third night on the floor. Those beloved grandparents of mine had been educated through the 3rd grade in Kentucky and had moved north to Chicago in the 30s in search of a better life. My mother dropped out of high school to marry my father, a gifted jazz saxophonist with a deeper commitment, shall we say, to his music than to raising his children. Yet each one of the adults in my family emphasized the importance of education, both as an essential part of the formula for moving up and forward in America, and as a means to be engaged in and informed about the world. In the community where every child was under the jurisdiction of every adult on the block, most of whom were of backgrounds and circumstances just like the one I've described. You might be surprised to know that every adult in the neighborhood placed that same importance on learning as both self-improvement and completeness. They also taught me that that is what a community is, a place where you see your stake in your neighbor's dreams and struggles as well as your own. Even in those broken, overcrowded classrooms on the South Side, I had amazing teachers. My 6th grade teacher taught us to count and say the greetings in German, took us to the first opera I'd ever seen and to a new movie out at the time called The Sound of Music, and used it to teach us about the rise of the Nazis and war in Europe. My 3rd grade teacher cultivated a love of reading for fun, and my 9th grade English teacher in particular, a love of language. They and the handful of other teachers who have stayed in my life since our days in the classrooms together were about more than the subject matter. They're about learning in the Louis Pasteur sense, about listening to anything without losing your temper or your self-confidence. They were, in a sense, about character. I wanted to start with this concept of character this evening because in many ways, I think that's what America is grappling with right now. We managed over the last year or so to politicize a national health emergency to the level of making a partisan choice out of wearing a mask or taking a life-saving vaccine. We made it seem that you have to hate police to believe Black Lives Matter, or to hate business to believe a livable wage or affordable housing is just. In a conversation with another group last month, one of the congregants asked a provocative, if I may say, downright Talmudic question. In essence, he asked, how can we both acknowledge the persistence of racism and deep economic disparities of which we are all so vividly reminded in this year, and in the same instant, as so many do, claim that this is not who we are? To me, that is the right question, because it gets at the character of the nation. To me, the miracle of America is that it is the only nation in human history organized around a set of civic ideals. Other nations have been organized by geography or religion or language or even culture, but America was organized around an idea of freedom. And we've come to understand over time and through struggle that freedom requires equality, opportunity, and fair play. I can argue that for all the imperfections of the founders, the genius of their work was to stand up a nation on enduring aspirations, the challenge of which would be ongoing. We are at our strongest domestically and abroad when we are striving to close the gap between our reality and our ideals, and at our weakest when we are not. The character of the country, in my view, depends on the work we do to close that gap. For true conservatives and progressives alike, or whatever it is you call yourself, that ought to be a common starting point. The rest ought to be about means, not ends. Which brings me to the other concept I wanted to mention at the outset as context for the conversation I'm looking forward to. And that is back to this notion of community. And by that, I'm talking about the sense of community I tried to describe a little bit when I was about growing up, the one where every child was under the jurisdiction of every adult on the block. You know, in those days, if you messed up down the street in front of Ms. Jones, she'd go upside your head as if you were hers and then call home. So you got it 2 times. They were just as engaged when you got a good report card or kept still and stopped squirming in church or picked up trash on the sidewalk in front of someone else's front stoops. What those adults were trying to get across to us, I believe, was that membership in a community is understanding that each of us has a stake in our neighbors' dreams and struggles as well as our own. That in some basic way, we belong to each other. So as I have been listening during this year and before, I am noticing that lots of people are feeling unseen and unheard. I'm noticing that the economic insecurity, social isolation, and despair, as seen in rates of suicides and substance abuse, are actually common realities both in poor communities of Black people and immigrants, and in communities of rural and other working class whites. I'm hearing the idea of government helping people help themselves coming back into fashion, not because so-called socialism is on the rise, but because government is not some abstraction, but us, you and me. Not surprisingly, I am also hearing an awful lot of folks working very, very hard to make sure we focus on every recent outrage to distract us from the work that members of community must do for one another, which is to confront and to fix the challenges we've created for ourselves. And those are big challenges: chronic poverty, crumbling infrastructure, all the ways the public schools so often fail poor children, domestic terrorism and white supremacy, allyship at home and abroad, the future of democracy itself. We can talk about any and all of them so long as you understand I do not pretend to have all the answers. I will be listening for yours. I wanted to start with some context about how I think about the issues that we're up against, and I wanted you to know also that I am hopeful. And the most hopeful thing to me right now is that Americans don't seem yet to have succumbed to our habitually short attention span. There is an urgency still, and that's good, because what we need to do may not all happen, before the midterms or in the Biden administration or even in our lifetimes. But if we keep listening and keep acting, I think it will. Thanks again for having me.
Wow, thank you, Governor. You're a role model to so many. I was wondering if you could back up and, furthering this conversation about character, tell us a little bit about some of the people who have been role models and sources of influence for you in your life.
Sure. Well, I mentioned some of those teachers. Mrs. Quaintance was that 6th grade teacher, amazing Black woman who, she was the first one who made us all, I think, not just me, all 35 of us, I think there were in the classroom, feel like it was possible to be a citizen of the world. That's an incredible gift to give to any child, I think. But in particular to kids like us who didn't have that frame of reference in most cases otherwise. There was an amazing teacher and other adults when I got to Milton Academy, which for me was like landing on a different planet when I was 14 years old. I saw it the night before classes began for the first time. I've told this story so many times about how that, they had a clothing list at the time. A dress code at the time. So when the clothing list arrived at home, saying that we were expected to wear jackets and ties to class, my grandparents splurged on a new jacket for me to wear to class. But a jacket in those days on the south side of Chicago was a windbreaker. So it wasn't until the next morning when all the boys were putting on their blue blazers and their tweed coats that I figured out I did not have a jacket in the Milton Academy since. You see, I figured it out since. But there were teachers there and other adults who helped crack the code. You know, they didn't shame you for not knowing. They helped you understand. And I think there are other mentors I have had in a similar nature in leadership positions that I have had, and they've made all the difference in the world.
Voting rights. Voting rights is a big issue in the public discourse right now, here in New York and across the country. We have a mayoral primary coming up in just about 2 weeks. Early voting actually starts this weekend. We're using ranked choice for the first time.
Right.
What do you think we should listen for from the candidates with respect to their views, their values, their proposals for building a stronger and more cohesive fabric for our city?
Ooh, Rabbi, you're actually trying to draw me into the New York City mayor race. You know how many friends I have in that race?
You don't have to endorse a candidate.
I'm not going to endorse a candidate. I mean, look, I will say this, and I say it admitting that I, having run for and held one elective office, I guess run for two if you count my 15-minute long presidential campaign. I think of myself as a relative amateur in politics. So my perspective is still as a citizen primarily, rather than a politician. And what I want as a citizen, what I wanted when I lived in New York, and what I want living in Massachusetts and in America is someone, well, maybe I'd say three things. First of all, someone running willing to lose. Meaning there's a set of real convictions. Folks are focusing on doing the job, not just getting it. Do you understand what I mean? So, and for me, that has to be more than just a list of programs. It has to be the ability to paint a picture about what you want the city, the state, the country to be after your very short time in office ends. And that is never, in my view, particularly given the scale of the challenges we face, about what government does alone. It's about what government and business and others in the private sector and the not-for-profit sector and individuals do so and contribute. So painting that picture helps people understand their part in what mission that elected official is on. So that's the first. The second is, I think it's really important to be, as my friend Brian Stevenson says, proximate. In campaigning, I think that means running at the grassroots. It means talking to everybody and to the theme of the evening, listening to everybody, because the truth of the matter is that no candidate and no party has a corner on all the best ideas. And, one of the things I found was so amazing because of the way we tried not just to run, but to govern, and being out as much as I was and with people in, not just at events, but just out with people, is that if you're listening closely, you start to hear consensus points, Rabbi. You start to hear people say some of the same things, and it focuses you in on what the agenda ought to be. It may not be exactly what you thought it ought to be, or it may have some point of emphasis that's different than the one you thought, and I can give you an example or two of that. And then the last thing I think is about communication. And that one, I have to say, I think has become harder at a time where there is so much communication, but, well, what is it I'm trying to say? There's so much noise and so little actual communication, actual engagement. If all of these jobs, candidate or serving in office, are a blend of substance and performance art, I will admit I was slow to get the performance art part I got it, I got it in the right balance. But nowadays, the emphasis seems almost, and the reward seems to be about the performance art part, and not the substance. That worries me a lot. So I think communicating the substance, what the substance is, and that the substance matters. It's not just at the point where it touches people, right? The policy actually matters where it touches people. And it's not just one-upsmanship with your political opponents. I think requires a kind of an energy and skill that I don't pretend to have, but I think I look for today in candidates.
Sure, we can't convince you to get back into politics and run for.
That's the next question. There are lots of ways to serve.
Look, I think it's so refreshing for us to hear some of the goals that you just articulated. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the obstacles might be to achieving those goals, sort of generally speaking, and then the maybe more specific obstacles for certain demographics? If we're talking about people of color, minorities, what stands in the way of getting from here to there?
Well, I have a lot of, for all of its frustrations and its sort of, its zigzagginess. I have a lot of faith in democracy, but we make democracy hard, and we've been making it harder. And much of the conversation today is about the intentional actions in that direction, the voter suppression laws in a number of states, and their disproportionate impact on Black and brown citizens and poor people. But in fact, they compromise everybody's democracy. I remember I worked for President Clinton, but I got to know him when he was governor, and I sued him in a voting rights case. And the issue there was about access to registration. And I sued him because in Arkansas, under the Constitution, the governor and the other constitutional officers are the leaders of the voting commission, the state voting commission. So it was in that official capacity. And then all the county clerks, who were the real, in much of the South, frankly, are the real source of political power and partisan power. We worked out the settlement together, in the terms of which became the bones of the motor voter law when he became president. So you could register when you got your driver's license or public benefits. Why should that be so hard? The origins of registration itself comes from Jim Crow. That's not what it was. Registration was about validating, the purity of the vote, not whether or not you were an eligible citizen. It was a different kind of eligibility. Okay, if we're going to have registration, why not make that simple? If you're going to have voter ID, why not make that simple? Why say you can use your NRA card, but you can't use your student ID, which is the law today in New Hampshire and in a number of other states? What is it about? We know what it's about. We know what it's about. It's about the view that we shouldn't have an actual competition of ideas. And I say this as a Democrat who doesn't think you have to hate Republicans to be a good Democrat. But more and more at the national level, it seems to me that the National Republican Party has decided they cannot win a fair fight. And so it's all about how to stack the deck and rig the rules so it's not a fair fight. And that should deeply concern us all of us. If Democrats' ideas are the ones for the moment, we should be able to compete and win. If Republican ideas are the ones for the moment, they should be able to compete and win. And then if the process works as it should, without gimmicks like the filibuster, and I, by the way, would not have described it that way just a couple of years ago. I've learned a lot more about the filibuster in the last little while. Then, we'd probably end up with some blend of the best ideas from either party or multiple persons, and actually get stuff done. And voting suppression is just one of them. So anyway, I'll stop talking.
So can we actually go back for a second to the 1990s and to your work in the Civil Rights Division?
Mhm.
Could you say something about sort of the difference between where we were then and where we are now, which is to say, what have we accomplished and what's still on the path ahead of us that's not yet accomplished?
Thank you for that question, Rabbi, because one of the kind of peculiar things I observe and I experience when we talk about civil rights, in particular um, issues of civil rights for Black people, is that we have camps that say, all that's finished, we've done that, and another camp that says nothing's happened, we're the same as we always were. And neither of those are complete, meaning we've made remarkable progress on in law and in life on race issues in this country, much of it in my lifetime. And I'm not that old. But it is still true that we are stuck on some bad habits or new versions of old bad habits. So it is harder to redline, if you will, on the basis of sales of property, but it still happens in terms of credit, and that often happens because of appraisals. And we've had that experience in our own family. My sister-in-law had a lovely house just outside of Atlanta that they were trying to sell many years ago, and the market was booming. They were getting lots of visits, but no offers. And finally, the realtor said, "Take down your family photographs and change out some of the art on the walls." They did, and within a day, they had a couple of offers and sold the house. And you're hearing these stories again now in the midst of the housing boom. It's not unusual. We don't have police misconduct is different today, but I would say one really interesting and to me kind of remarkable thing to come out of George Floyd's killing and so much of what has been exposed before and since then is that there is frequently a delta between the official account of what happened and the recorded account of what happened. Frequently, which is something we used to argue about in courts, but the officer or the practice under challenge always got the benefit of the doubt, and I think that has moved. I think we have more diversity in boardrooms, in executive suites, in all kinds of companies and workplaces. But we don't have diversity at the level of the talent we know exists in every community. And if you think about how immigration has been hard for a long time, but we, not a decade ago, had a consensus about comprehensive solutions, and it's been kept alive, in my view, as an unresolved issue, not just because it's hard, but because it is just too valuable as a politically divisive issue than it would be if it were actually solved. So I think we are not in the same place, but the challenges change, and they are hard, and but they've always been hard. And I love the idea that so many more people. I'm encouraged by the idea that so many more people are, as they say, woke. But I think my friend Anand Girdadas wisely said, the big point here is to make sure that the woke leave room for the still waking.
And if you had a magic wand and could change, one law in this country or one frame of reference in people's minds, what would it be?
Just one? I mean, I might be able to do my top three. Look, I think the
Maybe
first
three.
thing, I think the first thing is that we have to we have to have a functioning democracy. I think we can't decry autocracy coming from the right and then just hope to substitute that with a left-leaning autocracy. You know, we have to have a functioning democracy so that as we are asking people and challenging people to have something to vote for, right? Not just against, but for, to really be motivated to participate, then I think we have to have a system that enables their participation and encourages it. So the restoration of the Voting Rights Act through the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Reform Act and the For the People Act, S1 as it's sometimes called, I think those are really important. I think that we have to have a growing economy. And by that, I mean one that grows out to the middle and the marginalized and not just up to the well-connected. I think industrial policy is a part of that. And I think tax policy is part of that. And I think we have to stop being so afraid of talking about taxes. Taxes are not a penalty. They are the price of civilization. And so we should have the conversation about what kind of civilization we want, what we want government to do and not do, and then make the paying for that as equitable and as simple as we can. And I would have a tax code you could write on a piece of paper, or maybe two pieces of paper. But I think we have to have the conversation about taxes as the contribution we make to the civilization we want, rather than as a penalty. And by the way, on that score, I think both Republicans and Democrats make a terrible mistake in how we talk about tax policy. And I guess the third thing I would ask, I would wish for is national public service. And I say that because I think one of the reasons, I think the fact that we are as divided as we seem to be is worrisome. What's even more worrisome to me is that it was so easy to divide us. And the reason it's so easy to divide us is that we don't know each other. And so that idea, I mean, I think Israel has this right. I don't think, at least the polling says, we wouldn't be able to get it to be compulsory here in the United States. But if it was practically available and common, practically meaning people actually paid a wage that enabled, other than my kids to do it, and healthcare and, childcare if that was necessary. But the idea of people from different parts of the country with different perspectives working alongside each other in service of some unmet need, of which there are many, domestically or abroad, militarily or civilian, for a year or two, is a pretty powerful thing, and as a way to enable people to learn to push past the cartoon view we tend to have of each other.
We see ourselves as a nonprofit, as a synagogue community, and we've always kind of felt that we have a contribution to make. Businesses make a contribution to society, and government makes a contribution to society, and institutions like ours make a contribution to society. What's your advice for us in this moment? Where should we be putting our energies and our focus? What can be our unique contribution?
Well, any answer I give about what the congregation should do as a congregation will be presumptuous. I'm going to take a chance, though, and say, or maybe dodge the question this way. In addition to being congregants, members of the community of the synagogue, everybody is a neighbor, a parent, an investor, a business owner, go on down I guess what I would say is start with the moral lessons that come from faith. They are in common in my own Christian faith, and having read the Quran, they are in common in the fundamentals of Islam as well. They are nearly universal. Almost every known faith in the world has some version of what we call the golden rule. And there is a missing moral voice and character to the stuff we fuss about today, and a missing moral and a missing humility that also comes from much of that teaching. So I would say start there, and then take those lessons into all those roles that that your congregants and all of us have. In my church, we used to be told, church is not just what you say you believe on Sunday. It's how you live Monday through Saturday. It's how you live. It's what you do. Sometimes they are tiny acts of grace. Sometimes there are bigger decisions about whom to hire and whom to feed, and who to have at your dinner table, or whose invitation to accept. Just the ways in which we learn to have more, if you will, integrated lives with people of different backgrounds and points of view, and that takes energy and effort and angst and all that. But I mean, having tried it for a lot of decades now, it's also just unbelievably enriching.
So on that note, could you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing with young Israeli and Palestinian entrepreneurs?
OGS, yes. So we talked about this in advance, right? Our Generation Speaks is a program launched by a former Israeli young Israeli soldier who came to Brandeis for his undergraduate and graduate work. And I met him, and he talked about growing up in a very conservative village. I'm smiling because the stories are just marvelous. I've met his parents, but I haven't been to his village yet. A very conservative village, having very little exposure to Arab Israelis, let alone Palestinians. And he had an assignment to do surveillance of some town in the West Bank. Or it might have been in Gaza, come to think of it. But he describes being on a hillside or hilltop and just watching this village all day. And he said he watched and watched and watched, and he said they're just like us. He said they look like us. They do what we do every day. They're figuring it out and fussing at the kids, and the kids are playing, and he said day after day, and he kept thinking to himself, why don't I know my neighbors? And he talked about, in the first time I heard him talk about this publicly, what was missing and what his generation felt was missing was something called an infrastructure of hope. And so after I left office, he called me and said, I have this idea, would you help me get it going? And he was then in business school, and it was about drawing entrepreneurs from the region, Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis, West Bank Palestinians, and Gazans, together at Brandeis in the summer, small number, who would compete on the strength of their idea for a new enterprise. About 20, and they would come together at Brandeis for the summer, and they would work on those ideas together with local entrepreneurs from around Boston who would act as their mentors and coaches. They would live together, and they would vote them down to a handful of go forward businesses on which there would be integrated teams. And then with a little money, they'd go home and launch those businesses back in the region. It's been going on now for 6 or 7 years. And I'm still on. I'm back on the. I chaired the advisory committee for from the beginning, and I'm back on it now. And I think I was telling you about how we took the advisory committee on what was then its first visit to the region to visit fellows. There were probably 3 classes of fellows at that point. And we were able to be together at a venue, I think outside of Bethlehem. So that was a place where everybody could get to at that time. And the energy in the room was electric. The fellows could not get enough of each other. And at the debrief at the end of the trip with the other members of the advisory committee, we began to ask ourselves whether we should be most focused on the success of the enterprises or the success of the relationships, because the relationships were so enduring, and there have been so many examples, including in these last particularly challenging weeks, where fellows across those differences have come to each other's rescue. And I think it's a tremendous model, or maybe I'll put it as the founder did. It's a great example of an infrastructure of hope.
So, anti-Semitism is on the minds of many people on this call and many people in our congregation, particularly over the past few weeks. And I was wondering if you could share your thoughts kind of writ large on the topic, and maybe specifically with respect to relationships between members of the Jewish community and members of the Black community.
Mm.
And, while we're at it, if you could propose a solution for America.
Okay. I see our time is up. Look, I've been to Israel 5 times now, I think, in an official and personal capacity, in both official and personal capacities. I will say that among the things that struck me most about being in Israel, and I've traveled to the West Bank as well, I haven't visited Gaza, is how small it is. That everybody is cheek by jowl, and the neighborhood is complicated. There's no way around it. But there is a resilience and there has been, it comes and goes. It ebbs and flows, I guess is what I want to say. But there's a sense of the miracle of the place that I think is shared by Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis I have met. And I'm not glossing over the frustrations by any means. That's one. And also the frustration, although, all you got to do to be in politics is announce that you got a party and, bring your family along, you got a big party and off you go. It's everybody's talking about politics. In that sense, it's a very, very vibrant democracy. But it is also true that the disparities are considerable. The disparities of opportunity are considerable. And the partitioning, if that's the right word, of the West Bank and Gaza, practical though it may be, is it shouldn't surprise anybody that is going to be jarring to Americans who have been trying to overcome that concept here in the United States, Black or white, right? Overcome that concept in the United States. And in a way, I remember on my first visit, I got to be friends with the former president before he passed away, and and he was just funny and wise. And I remember he was saying, how no one likes to have their own family criticized by somebody outside the family. And he said, and that's true of races and religions. He said, no one, you don't like it when other people criticize Black people writ large as if we are some monolith and as if they know better, than I do or others. And it's the same. It's the same for Jewish people. I completely understand that. So we become, I think, defensive of what, because we understand the complexities in ways that folks outside the race or the religion or the whatever the tribe is, if you will, and I use that word with no disrespect intended. It's hard to hear that if you don't get the complexities that someone inside does. But it's important to engage. And most people do, that some of the most important allies of Black people during the 60s, the 50s and 60s civil rights struggle were leaders in the Jewish community, particularly Jewish clergy. It doesn't surprise me really, because there was a common moral question called, right? And I think there is still a common moral question called, and we ought to be able to have a conversation around that moral challenge on all sides, without folks without folks being disrespectful from the outside of the complexities. And I would hope without folks on the inside feeling like those questions can't be called by people from outside the community. Does that make sense? But I think that only happens if you have relationships. I met this really great guy at in the Arab market, in the Arab section in Jerusalem, in the old city, who had lived in that house, or his family had lived in that house for something like 150 years. And he said his mother, and they live up above, he runs a shop down below. And I've come, and his mother, I've been to this shop 3 or 4 times, taken there by a Jewish American leader from the United States who had come over with me when I was honored at the Rudin Center. And he said, I grew up and my friends were Jews, they were Armenians, they were Christians, we all lived together, we knew each other. He said, my children don't know others. They don't know, they travel to the United States, they speak English, but when they come home, they are in a box. They are thought of in the box, they think in a box, they think of themselves in a box. I understand exactly what that's like. Exactly what that's like. And it's sort of back to my point about the importance of national service as just one solution, that we have to have ways to come to know each other. I will tell you this one thing at the risk of even more controversy. Whatever you think of the Iran nuclear agreement, and there's a lot to think about that. I understand that the people who made it happen were young people on the staffs of the leadership in Iran, in the United States, and in one other key player, I can't remember now, who knew each other from other settings, who were the ones who figured out how to get a deal. And there were their counterparts within the Israeli government at the time, trying to help them get to that deal. Now, the leadership was in a different place in many of those places, but my point is, and the point was, just like at OGS rather, that Our Generation Speaks, there are relationships there that will bear fruit that we don't even know of yet. But that tilling of the soil, I think, has to happen in every way we can think of, domestically and abroad.
So we've gathered a few questions here from the audience, and before we run out of time, with your permission, maybe we'll do kind of like a lightning round and rattle off 5 or so questions in the next 5 minutes.
Sure. I'm sorry I babble on so long. Do I get points for getting?
Yeah. You get 3 points for
don't tell me
every right answer.
Okay.
And then the grand prize is obviously a trip for 2 to New York City. Um, Question from the audience: how can we do a better job instilling American values? There's been substantial pushback against these values, and what can we do to address it?
Well, this is I'm supposed to be lightning my answer. We can educate the whole of our history. I know that's a point of some controversy today. But when you think about it, the arc of our history is remarkable, and it points in the direction of these aspirational and founding values. So I think that's important. And we should ask our candidates and our office holders and other public leaders to link their proposals to those values. And it's a test, really, because if they can't, maybe those shouldn't be priorities. Maybe we should move on to other things.
Governor, you talked about national service. I'm in complete agreement. How do we make it happen?
Well, in the rescue plan, I co-chair something called the Service Alliance with General McChrystal. So these are not abstract issues to me. I'm very much a believer, and our group was able to get a substantial increase in the service budget through the American Rescue Plan. So that's a start. I do think we have to, we have to have the practical resources to make it possible, but we also have to evangelize about it a little bit, right? Our daughter took a gap year between college and between high school and college, not because that was her first thought, but because it was clear from choosing, between NYU, I can't remember what tiny remote college, and the Culinary Institute of America, that she didn't know what she wanted to do. And she grew up in that year. She had an experience. She didn't sit around and, play video games. She had some meaningful and important and challenging experiences. I think, it was great because we could handle that for her. But, if at her age, I could not have done that by myself. And I think we have to make it practically possible for a wide range of young people. But then we have to really evangelize it, talk about it as a value and expectation.
In such a polarizing time, are there books, movies, podcasts, TED Talks, or anything else that you can recommend that will inspire a more cohesive society?
Mercy. There are a lot of great books. I mean, some of them are hard, like Caste. If you haven't read Wilkerson's latest book, Caste, it's just remarkable how much we don't know. Or I'll put it this way: how much I thought I knew. And to me, it was helpful because I don't think there's a single problem that we have made that is beyond our capacity to care about and to solve. So in the sense of kind of scaling down what feel like big existential challenges is really, really helpful, I think, to read books like that. I love I have read many of the speeches of and the writings of Lincoln, of Churchill, and of FDR, who were three political leaders I think were remarkable in their ability to cast challenges in this frame of values and to speak on the whole in plain language that everybody could understand. And still impart conviction. So to me, words still have a place. So I do take some, and actually, there are not many of the challenges we're facing that are all that new. They just have new veneer. And then I've been reading Thurman's sermons. Howard Thurman sermons, does that name mean anything to you? He was a famous Baptist seminarian, and just a wise man. So a couple of ideas. I watch TV all the time because some of the best TV is happening right now. But I'd be embarrassed to tell you the things I'm watching.
Last question. It's been a difficult time for America for lots of reasons. What gives you hope for the future?
Well, I touched on this, I think, at the end of my opening remarks, Rabbi. What gives me hope is that there seems to be sustained attention paid to some of these big challenges. You know, climate change, there's a generation that on climate change, on racism, on economic and social justice, it feels like they have put their collective foot down and said, enough. We're just not going to do this. We're not going to take the same answers. And you know, they've been joined by a lot of older allies. And I find that incredibly refreshing. And I think that the big challenge for, as an old ally, is not to tamp down that urgency with, you know, admonitions about what is and is not practical. I think I can be more helpful by helping to shape that urgency and direct it than say, no, you can't do that because we tried that before, or, you know, nobody's listening or what have you. And there are things, and it's hard because, you know, I feel like I'm becoming that guy that I used to think about and talk to who is who could be perceived as trying to slow folks down. And just as an example, you know, nobody wants to actually eliminate policing. Why are we even talking about that? On the other hand, we shouldn't be so cautious about our choice of words that we don't express the anguish that comes from chronic or consistently unfair policing. And so nobody wants to defund the police. I get it, sounds great, and so on, but you know, so does no new taxes. And that has been incredibly destructive in a society where we've got a lot of unmet needs.
Wow, Governor, if this were a game show and if we had a grand prize, you certainly would have won it. So much for your inspiring work and your inspiring words. For a closing word now, it's a pleasure to turn things over to Virginia Bear-Hurt, our former president and co-chair of our Yoval committee.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Governor Patrick, thank you so much for your thoughtful insights into our world today, the cultural, the social environment that we're living in. And your model of leadership continues to inspire me, and I'm sure all the people who are listening, as well as Americans of all backgrounds. So I thank you for that. As Rabbi Levine said, this evening marks the end of our year-long initiative, a year of very active listening. And just to recap in 2 seconds, we've examined our value-laden texts. We've looked at historical and legal documents and events, talked about the education of our children, the current moment in regard to policing and anti-Semitism, and the lived experiences of people of color within our Jewish community and within our neighborhood. And as a result, I think we really are now much better informed and are able to think about the challenges facing society and what we've heard from Governor Patrick tonight to help us think about what our role could possibly be as individuals or as a community acting together. All of this was made possible through the wisdom and diligence of the Yoval Planning Committee and the host committee. And just want to thank everyone so much for the work that you've done. And finally, on behalf of my co-chair, Ora Weinbach, and myself, want to say thank you to Rabbi Levine and to our president, Andrew Bordak, for their ongoing and constant support of this program. And especially a thank you to all of you who have been the active listeners and who participated so consistently throughout this year of programming.